It was early morning in Tecoluca, El Salvador. A convoy of buses reached the gates of a sprawling high-security prison built on isolated plains 70 kilometers east of the capital. Inside were rows of men formerly accused of gang involvement, now counted among tens of thousands processed under a sweeping state security policy. This prison was designed for up to 40,000 inmates, more people than live in the surrounding town. It had no set date for release, and its director publicly stated that those who entered would not leave on foot. Why was this facility built? And what does its existence tell us about crime, government power, and human rights in the 21st century? This is a factual documentary about one of the most controversial prison systems in the world, El Salvador's Terrorism Confinement Center, often referred to by its Spanish acronym CECOT. In the years after 2022, the government of El Salvador embarked on a national anti-gang policy involving mass arrests and the construction of a mega-prison capable of housing tens of thousands of inmates. The story we will tell is based on real, verified events from reliable international reporting, human rights documentation, and public records. Our aim is to explore what this prison is, why it was created, what happened to the people sent there, and how it fits into broader issues of state policy and justice. We present the facts clearly without sensational language so you can understand the historical and societal context. The country that couldn't sleep. For years, El Salvador was known for something that terrified the world. Not its beaches. Not its culture. Not its history. It was known for its violence. By the early 2010s, El Salvador had become one of the most dangerous countries on earth, with homicide rates that shocked even people living in other high-crime regions. Entire neighborhoods were controlled by gangs, and many ordinary families lived with a daily routine of fear. In some areas, simply walking down the wrong street could be seen as a threat. And the most powerful groups weren't secret. They had names. Two gangs, in particular, dominated the country's criminal landscape. MS-13, also known as Mara Salvatrucha, and Barrio 18, known as the 18th Street Gang. These groups were not just street gangs in the traditional sense. Over time, they became organized networks that controlled territory, extorted businesses, recruited children, and punished anyone who refused to cooperate. For many Salvadorans, this wasn't crime happening somewhere else. It was happening at their front door. In many communities, gang members decided who could enter, who could leave, and who could live peacefully. Even small things like what bus route you used could be dangerous. A system built on extortion. One of the most common realities was extortion. Shop owners, taxi drivers, street vendors, and even teachers were often forced to pay what gangs called rent. It wasn't rent for property. It was rent for survival. If someone didn't pay, they could lose their business, their home, or be forced to leave their neighborhood. Many families simply ran out of money. Others fled the country. Some disappeared. Over time, Salvadorans began to believe something painful. That the gangs were stronger than the state. Because in many areas, police could not enter safely. And when they did, they often stayed only briefly. The failed solutions. For years, different governments tried different approaches. Some tried strict policing. Others tried negotiation. One of the most controversial moments came in 2012, when reports emerged that the Salvadoran government had supported a truce between rival gangs. For a short time, killings dropped. But the truce did not end the gang system. And when it collapsed, violence returned. Many critics argued that gangs used the truce to reorganize, gain influence, and strengthen their control. Instead of solving the problem, it may have delayed it. And the public's trust kept shrinking. People started asking a dangerous question. If the government cannot protect us, what is the point of the government? The moment everything changed. Then, in March 2022, El Salvador reached a breaking point. In a single weekend, the country experienced a surge in killings. Dozens of people were murdered in a short period of time, making it one of the deadliest stretches in modern Salvadoran history. The government blamed gang violence. And the nation watched in shock. For many Salvadorans, this was the final proof that the gang problem was not under control. It was growing. And now, the government responded with something the country had never seen before. Not a new police program. Not a new prison wing. Not a negotiation. But a national emergency measure. The state of exception. Soon after the killings, the Salvadoran government, led by President Nayib Bukele, announced a sweeping crackdown. The country entered what became known as the state of exception. This policy allowed authorities to suspend certain constitutional protections, giving police and military forces expanded power to arrest suspected gang members. The government argued it was necessary to restore order. Supporters said it was long overdue. But critics warned it could lead to wrongful arrests, abuse of power, and weakened due process. Still, the arrests began immediately. And they didn't stop. Day after day the numbers climbed. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. In neighborhoods once controlled by gangs, the military patrolled streets with rifles, stopping vehicles and searching people in public. The message was clear. El Salvador was no longer negotiating. It was hunting. Mass arrests on a national scale. By the end of 2022, the government reported tens of thousands of arrests tied to gang suspicion. Many were detained based on intelligence, anonymous tips, tattoos, or association with known gang areas. The government said it was capturing the backbone of organized crime. But human rights groups began reporting a different story. They documented claims that some people arrested had no criminal record. Some were workers. Some were teenagers. Some were simply in the wrong place. Families said they didn't know where their relatives had been taken. In many cases, people were held without immediate trial. And the prison system began to overflow. El Salvador already had prisons. But they were not built for what was happening now. The government was arresting people faster than the system could hold them. And that created a new problem. A massive one. Where do you put tens of thousands of detainees? The plan for a mega prison. Then the government announced something that stunned the world. A prison unlike anything in Latin America. A facility built not for hundreds, not for thousands, but for 40,000 inmates. It would be one of the largest prisons ever constructed in the modern world. It would be built quickly. It would be heavily guarded. And it would become the symbol of the government's war against gangs. The prison's location was chosen far from major cities, in a more isolated area of the country. The government said it would be impossible to escape. It would not be a rehabilitation center. It would be a confinement center. A place designed for people the state labeled as terrorists. And soon it had a name. CECOT. The Terrorism Confinement Center. The first images that shook the world. When the first official images and videos of transfers were released, they spread worldwide. Large groups of detainees were shown being moved in coordinated lines, guarded by armed officers. The government presented it as proof that the state had regained control. Supporters saw strength. Opponents saw intimidation. International media organizations began reporting on the scale of the operation. The story became global. A small country had launched one of the most aggressive anti-gang crackdowns in modern history. And now it had built a prison large enough to hold a small city. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Who exactly was being sent there? And what would life inside that prison actually look like? Because CECOT was not just a building. It was a message to gangs, a message to citizens, and a message to the world. And as the gates of the mega prison opened for the first mass transfers, the world realized something chilling. El Salvador was not simply building a prison. It was building a new era of justice, one that would be praised by millions and condemned by others. But what was the real truth behind those walls? And what happens to a country when it locks away tens of thousands of people at once? Building CECOT, the prison made for 40,000. CECOT was not built quietly. It was built like a national announcement. After the mass arrests began in 2022, El Salvador's prison system started reaching its limit. Existing prisons were already overcrowded. Cells designed for a few people were often holding many more. And as the government continued its crackdown, the number of detainees kept rising. The Bukele administration made it clear. This was not a temporary operation. This was a long-term strategy. And to make that strategy work, El Salvador needed a prison on a scale the country had never seen before. So the government began constructing a new facility in the municipality of Tecoluca, in the department of San Vicente, far from the busiest cities. This location was not chosen for comfort. It was chosen for control. CECOT was designed to be isolated, heavily guarded, and difficult to approach without being detected. The government described it as a prison for the most dangerous gang members. A place where communication, movement, and escape would be almost impossible. A mega prison with a military mindset. From the beginning, CECOT was presented as more than a prison. It was treated like a security fortress. The design included multiple layers of walls and fencing, armed watchtowers, surveillance systems, strong perimeter security, strict internal control zones. Unlike older prisons, which were often criticized for weak control and gang dominance, CECOT was built with one main purpose: to prevent gangs from operating inside. In previous years, authorities and investigators had reported that some Salvadoran prisons became places where gangs still controlled inmates, ordered crimes and ran extortion networks from behind bars. CECOT was meant to end that. This was a prison designed to break communication, to break leadership, to break organization. They will never leave. When government officials spoke publicly about CECOT, the language was blunt. They described it as a place where inmates would not return to society. In interviews and public statements, the message was repeated again and again. This prison was not about reintegration. It was about permanent removal. Supporters of the crackdown saw this as a relief. Many Salvadorans had lost family members to violence. Many had lived under gang control for years. Some felt the country had been taken hostage. So for them, CECOT was not frightening. It was hopeful. It was the first time they believed the government had finally taken back power. But for critics, the statements raised a serious concern. If people are sent somewhere with no clear path to release, what happens to justice? What happens to fair trials? What happens to mistakes? Because when the state builds a prison for 40,000 people, it suggests something bigger than punishment. It suggests a system preparing for mass imprisonment as normal. The first transfers. In early 2023, the first large transfers began. Videos were released showing detainees being moved in controlled lines, surrounded by guards. The government's footage was carefully organized and highly public. To the Bukele administration, it was proof of success. Proof that the state was winning. The prisoners shown in the videos were almost always described as gang members. But outside the official narrative, questions were spreading internationally. Human rights organizations were warning that the mass arrest policy, carried out under the state of exception, could include people detained without strong evidence. Some families claimed their relatives had been taken despite having no gang ties. And because court processes were slowed or limited, many detainees had little chance to challenge their detention quickly. This created a serious tension in the public conversation. El Salvador may have been reducing crime. But was it also creating a system where innocence could be ignored? Inside the world's most watched prison, CECOT quickly became one of the most photographed and discussed prisons on earth. The images were unforgettable. Large cell blocks, rows of bunks, bright lights, bare concrete. Inmates were shown living in groups under constant surveillance with strict movement control. Officials stated that prisoners were not allowed to have normal prison privileges. No personal property. No outdoor freedom. No typical visitation system. The government said this was necessary because gangs had previously used prison privileges to continue criminal operations. CECOT was meant to eliminate every weakness. But to critics, the same images raised another question. When punishment becomes extreme and permanent, does it create security, or does it create future instability? A prison that became a political symbol. CECOT was not only a prison. It became a symbol of Bukele's presidency. It was proof of his strongest political promise. That he would dismantle gang power completely. And internationally, people started comparing El Salvador's strategy to other historical crackdowns. Some praised, some condemned. Supporters around the world called Bukele a leader who did what others were too afraid to do. But journalists and rights groups began investigating the arrests, the conditions and the legal process behind the mass imprisonment. Because one detail could not be ignored. The prison was built fast. The arrests were faster. And the number of detainees was growing at a rate rarely seen in modern democratic systems. The question that grew louder. By the time CECOT became fully active, El Salvador's government was claiming that the country had become safer than it had been in decades. Tourism increased. Business confidence rose. Public support for Bukele surged. But at the same time, international observers were asking uncomfortable questions. How many of those detained have actually been convicted? How many are being held only on suspicion? How long can the state of exception continue? What happens if the system arrests the wrong people? Because the reality was simple. CECOT could hold 40,000 inmates. But the government had already arrested far more than that nationwide. Meaning this mega prison was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And as the prison filled, the government continued to announce new arrest totals. The message was clear. More were coming. But the world was now asking a different question. CECOT is the answer. Then what exactly is the problem El Salvador is preparing for? The state of exception, how El Salvador changed its laws, improved short version. CECOT did not appear by accident. It was built because El Salvador's entire legal system shifted almost overnight. In March 2022, the country experienced one of its deadliest periods in years. In just a short span of time, dozens of killings were reported across the nation. The government blamed the violence on gang retaliation and coordination. For many Salvadorans, this moment felt like proof that the gangs still had power. And the government responded with a decision that would reshape the country. El Salvador entered what became known as the state of exception. This emergency measure, approved by the Legislative Assembly, allowed the government to temporarily suspend certain constitutional rights in the name of national security. Officials said it was the only way to dismantle the gang system quickly. A new system of arrests. Under the state of exception, police and military forces were given expanded authority. Authorities could arrest people more easily, detain them for longer periods, and restrict certain legal protections that would normally apply in criminal cases. Across the country, daily life changed. Military patrols increased. Checkpoints appeared. Entire neighborhoods were searched. In places where gangs had controlled streets for years, residents suddenly saw armed officers standing on corners that had once been ruled by criminals. To many citizens, it felt like the government had finally returned. But to others, it felt like the country was entering a new era of fear. Only now the fear came from the state itself. The arrest numbers grew fast. Within weeks, the arrests began to climb at a scale rarely seen in modern democracies. Thousands were detained. Then tens of thousands. Over time, the government reported that more than 70,000 people had been arrested as part of the crackdown. This became one of the largest mass detention campaigns in Latin America's modern history. The Bukele administration framed these arrests as a necessary step to dismantle MS-13 and Barrio 18 networks, which had controlled communities through extortion, threats, and violence. Supporters believed this was exactly what El Salvador needed. They argued that gangs had ruled for decades because the government had been too weak, too slow, or too afraid. The courts couldn't keep up. But as the arrest numbers grew, another problem surfaced. The justice system began to overload. El Salvador's courts were not built to process tens of thousands of detainees quickly. Judges, prosecutors, and public defenders were pushed to their limits. The government introduced legal reforms that allowed detainees to be processed in large groups, sometimes in mass hearings. Officials said it was necessary to handle the emergency. Critics argued that this system reduced individual review, making it harder to separate confirmed gang members from innocent citizens. And once the system became overwhelmed, a new question emerged. If someone is arrested by mistake, how long will it take to prove it? Praise inside the country, concern outside it. Inside El Salvador, public support for the crackdown remained extremely strong. Many citizens said they finally felt safe. Some businesses reopened. Tourism increased. Communities that were once controlled by gangs began to change. But outside the country, human rights organizations raised concerns. They warned that the state of exception could lead to wrongful detention, lack of due process, and a dangerous precedent where emergency powers become permanent. Because the policy was not temporary. It was renewed again and again, month after month. And the longer it continued, the clearer it became. El Salvador was no longer using emergency measures to solve a crisis. It was building an entire national security model around emergency power. The final shift. And this is where CECOT's true purpose becomes clearer. A country does not build a prison for 40,000 inmates unless it expects long-term mass detention. CECOT was not only a place to hold prisoners. It was the physical symbol of a new system. A system where the government could arrest faster than the courts could process. A system where incarceration became a central tool of national policy. And as the prison began filling, the world watched closely, because the story was no longer just about gangs. It was now about government power, about justice, and about what happens when a nation chooses security at full speed. Because once the state of exception became normal, the biggest question was no longer whether gangs would survive. It was whether El Salvador's legal system would. And if the emergency never ends, who decides where the line is drawn? Inside CECOT, the rules of a prison without normal life. CECOT was not built to function like a normal prison. It was built to function like a sealed system. A place where control is constant, movement is limited, and contact with the outside world is almost non-existent. When the Salvadoran government officially presented the Terrorism Confinement Center to the world in 2023, it described the facility as a response to decades of gang power. Officials claimed that older prisons had become places where gangs still operated, planned crimes, and controlled other inmates. CECOT was designed to stop that completely. This was not a prison designed for rehabilitation. It was designed for containment, a facility made for scale. CECOT was built to hold up to 40,000 inmates, making it one of the largest prisons in the world. The government stated that the facility contained multiple large cell blocks, designed to hold hundreds of inmates per unit. The prison was built with industrial efficiency in mind, large spaces, constant surveillance, and strict organization. According to government statements and official tours, the prison includes high concrete walls and fencing, guard towers and armed patrols, surveillance systems, internal zones to control movement, areas designed to restrict communication. The goal was simple. CECOT was meant to be a prison where gangs could not organize, because in the past, gang leaders had allegedly continued running criminal networks even while behind bars. CECOT was supposed to end that. The conditions that made headlines. When images from inside the prison began circulating internationally, they caused immediate global reaction. The footage showed large shared cells filled with metal bunks, bright lighting, and minimal personal items. Inmates were shown sitting in organized rows under watch, wearing prison uniforms. Officials stated that inmates would not have access to items that could allow communication or control, such as phones, normal visitation privileges, or personal belongings. The government's message was direct. This prison would not be negotiated with. There would be no gang authority inside. Only state authority. To supporters, this looked like a necessary step to break organized crime. To critics, it looked like a system designed to punish through strict isolation and permanent confinement. Control was the main purpose. CECOT was structured to prevent one thing above all else: coordination. In gang systems, communication is power. If leaders can communicate, they can give orders. If members can organize, they can create discipline. If networks remain active, the gang survives. CECOT was built to remove that possibility. That is why the prison's rules, according to officials, focus on limiting inmate movement, restricting contact with the outside world, controlling daily routines tightly, maintaining constant surveillance, preventing personal control inside the cell blocks. The government presented this as the most secure prison in the country, and possibly the most secure prison in the region. No public lists, no easy confirmation. But as CECOT became famous worldwide, another issue became impossible to ignore. The public did not have clear access to a full list of who was being held there. The government stated that the facility was for terrorists and gang members. However, human rights groups and investigative journalists raised concerns about transparency. They questioned whether the system could guarantee that every detainee was truly guilty of gang crimes, especially under a legal environment shaped by the state of exception. Because CECOT was not being filled through normal criminal court timelines. It was being filled through mass detention operations. That created uncertainty. Not about whether gangs existed, because they did, but about whether every person locked behind those walls belonged there. The world began to ask different questions. As CECOT gained attention, international media outlets, observers, and rights organizations began focusing on one key issue. What happens to people once they enter this prison? The Bukele administration's public messaging suggested long-term detention. Officials implied that those inside were not coming back to society. This became one of the most debated parts of the CECOT story. Supporters argued that gang members had destroyed the country for decades, and the prison was the only way to prevent them from returning to violence. Critics argued that justice systems must still allow due process, fair trials, and legal review, even for those accused of serious crimes. Because without legal checks, even the most popular crackdown can become a system where power has no limit. CECOT as a warning, not just a prison. CECOT quickly became more than a facility. It became a symbol. To many Salvadorans, it symbolized safety. To others, it symbolized fear. To international observers, it symbolized a larger question about modern government power. It showed how quickly a country can change when crime becomes unbearable. And it showed what a government can build when it has public support, political momentum, and emergency authority. But the prison also created a new reality. Once a country builds a place designed for tens of thousands of detainees, it creates pressure to keep filling it. And as CECOT's population grew, the government continued reporting new arrest numbers nationwide. Which led to the next question. If the gangs were being defeated, why were the arrests still increasing? And more importantly, what happens when a prison built for 40,000 becomes normal? Because CECOT wasn't just holding people. It was reshaping El Salvador's future. And now the world was waiting to see what would come next. The global debate, safety, rights, and the price of control. By 2023, El Salvador was no longer just fighting gangs. It was rewriting its national identity. CECOT had become the centerpiece of the Bukele government's anti-gang campaign, and the world watched the country like a real-time experiment. Because something rare was happening. A nation that once struggled with some of the highest homicide rates in the world was now reporting major drops in violence. And for many Salvadorans, the change felt real. People reported being able to walk in neighborhoods they once avoided. Businesses reopened without paying extortion. Public transportation routes became safer. Tourism increased. Foreign media began describing El Salvador as transformed. The government presented this as proof that its strategy worked. The message was simple. The gangs were losing. And the state was winning. Why so many people supported it? To understand why the crackdown gained such strong support, you have to understand what gangs represented to ordinary Salvadorans. For decades, gangs were not just criminals. They were an unofficial power structure. They controlled neighborhoods, punished disobedience, recruited youth, and demanded money from families who could barely afford food. Many Salvadorans did not see gangs as a social problem. They saw them as an occupying force. So when the government arrested tens of thousands of suspected members and began locking them inside CECOT, many citizens felt something they hadn't felt in years. Relief. To them, CECOT was not a symbol of cruelty. It was a symbol that the country had finally taken its streets back. The criticism that would not go away. But while support remained high inside El Salvador, international concern continued to grow. Human rights groups, legal experts, and journalists raised key questions about the system behind the prison. Their main concern was not whether gangs were dangerous. That was already proven. Their concern was how fast and wide the crackdown had become. They questioned how many detainees had received full legal hearings. How many were held based on suspicion alone? How many were arrested due to anonymous accusations or living in gang-controlled areas? How many might be innocent but trapped in a system moving too quickly to correct mistakes? Reports began to emerge of families searching for detained relatives, sometimes with little information about where they were held or what evidence was being used against them. Critics argued that mass arrests can create a dangerous pattern. When the government arrests thousands at once, it becomes harder to separate the guilty from the innocent. And when a prison like CECOT becomes the solution, the system can begin relying on imprisonment as its main tool. The real question: what is justice in a crisis? CECOT created a worldwide debate because it forced people to confront a difficult truth. Crime can destroy a country. But extreme government power can reshape it forever. Supporters argued that El Salvador had no choice. They believed the justice system had been too weak for too long, and that gang violence required an emergency response. But critics argued that a government must still follow legal standards, even during emergencies. Because once rights are removed, restoring them is not guaranteed. And once emergency power becomes normal, the line between security and authoritarian control becomes harder to see. This is why CECOT became one of the most discussed prisons on earth. It was not just about inmates. It was about the future of law itself. The bigger consequence. Even if El Salvador's crackdown permanently reduces gang violence, the country will still face a major long-term challenge. What happens to a society after mass incarceration? A prison like CECOT is built for tens of thousands, but it does not answer questions about long-term justice, rehabilitation, or reintegration. If the majority of detainees remain imprisoned for years, the country must deal with overcrowding across the system, legal backlogs, future political pressure, economic costs, and deep social division. Because a prison can remove criminals from the street, but it cannot automatically repair broken communities. It cannot automatically heal families, and it cannot replace a stable legal system. CECOT may represent strength, but it also represents a new dependency. A country depending on mass detention to maintain order. The final image. Today, CECOT stands in Tecoluca like a concrete monument. It is massive. It is heavily guarded. It is designed to hold human beings in numbers that feel almost impossible to imagine. And whether people view it as justice or fear, one truth is undeniable. CECOT is one of the clearest symbols of how far a government will go when a nation reaches its breaking point. For some, it represents safety regained. For others, it represents rights suspended. But for the world, it represents a warning that when crime becomes powerful enough, the response can change an entire country. Not just for criminals, but for everyone. El Salvador's mega-prison was not built in a vacuum. It was built after decades of gang violence, extortion, and fear that shaped daily life for millions of innocent people. CECOT became the government's strongest answer to that crisis. An answer designed to remove gang influence through permanent confinement and strict control. But its existence also forces a serious global question. How do nations fight organized crime without losing the legal protections that define justice? Because safety is not only about fewer murders. It is also about transparency, fairness, and accountability. And the story of CECOT is still unfolding. It is a story of a country that was once overwhelmed by gang power and chose the most aggressive prison strategy in its history to take control back. Whether history will remember it as a necessary rescue or a dangerous precedent depends on what happens next, and on whether justice, in the end, can survive the war against fear. If you found this documentary educational, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And comment below. Do you believe mega prisons like CECOT are the future of crime control, or a risk to human rights?